This quarter, as the elders and I sat and we contemplated what ought to be the palette of spiritual food that we'll provide for Chestnut Hill. What are we in need of for this coming quarter to close a year that no one will ever forget? And we came up with a theme for the quarter: the power of God's salvation. And we have attempted to pour this theme into you through sermons and song choices and scriptures and responsive readings, studies. In sermon, Elder Dever and I have made every attempt to fasten your minds to the grand power of this theme, the power of God's salvation. At the very beginning of this quarter, I preached on his victorious power, his overcoming power, his triumphant power, his eternal power. And then Elder Dever followed that up with the three principles of salvation that remind you of the power of God to save. I followed that up with a sermon entitled By His Power. And wouldn't you know it, Elder Dever came back with the power of God. And then I came back with, in the moment of crisis, God shows up and Jesus stands up. And then we followed up with garments of salvation. Jesus's power and his willingness to save. And he does so through his robe of suffering and his robe of victory and his robe of righteousness. And Elder Dever came back and preached on freedom that we get through the power of God's salvation, that we get freedom from the penalty of sin and freedom from the power of sin and freedom from the very presence of sin. And I came back talking about the wonderful power that we experience with the grace of God, that my identity is forged by the grace of God, that my purpose and my path is redefined by the power and the grace of God, that all of us, when we go to God and accept him, we can say that you may not choose me, but whatever I am what I am by the grace and the power of God. And then last Sabbath, Elder Dever preached on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for what God has done through the power of his salvation. These precious themes we've attempted to bring before you are attempts to convince you of the power of God's salvation. And as we think about how God's salvation is played out in this year, as we think about how it's played out during a global pandemic, social inequality, riots, marches, demonstrations, wildfires, political turmoil, a sinking economy, government and self-imposed quarantines that estrange us from our loved ones, masks and gloves and hand sanitizers that have become now the new basics of our lives, and frontline workers in the midst of all of that, risking it all. This has been a remarkable year. We will never forget it. Some say, like Job, we are facing all of the adversity here and we have escaped, those of us who are here now, by the very skin of our teeth. Job says, my bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I am escaped with the very skin of my teeth. And I want you to know that while you've been praying this year, while you call upon him in prayer, he's calling upon you with his power. If you don't remember anything else, I want you to hold that as tough as it feels, as dark as it seems, that while you call upon him in prayer, he's calling upon you with his power. It's been a tough year, but his power has not moved. He calls you today. Come now. Come out of your darkness. Come out of your danger. Come out of your depression. Come, let me extract you from your doubt. Come now. Let me rescue you from your despondency. Come now. If you stay there, you will die. Come here now, away from your spiritual death. And I want you to know that God in glory wants to give you everything that he gave to Jesus while he was here. And that includes a resurrection on things that would remind you, would tell you, would portray death. Now, you may say, Jesus never had 2020. I would say he had his own 2020. That he prayed, but things didn't get better. They seemed to get worse. That he prayed in that year, in his last year of his life, but at some point, even though he prayed, he could not feel God. That he prayed and he questioned God. Where are you? How comes I can't see the evidence of you? I can't feel you. I'm surrounded by injustice and sickness and disease and racial and cultural inequality. There is political imbalance, not just on the outside in the government, but in the inside of the church. There's poverty among my people. There are demonstrations against Rome. There's injustice against God's people. And yet, I can't feel you. I see the frontline disciples willing to follow me, wanting to do what we have planned for them to do. But my God, why is it that when I pray in this year that is unforgettable, that I can't feel you? Jesus had his 2020. Isaiah speaks about this wonderful but horrible experience that he would go through. Wonderful for us, but painful for him, that he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. That he was despised, that he bore our griefs and carried our sorrows as his, that he was stricken and smitten of God and afflicted, that he was wounded for our transgressions. It was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. That he was oppressed and he was afflicted. That last year of his life, he had his 2020. And just when it got to its worst, just when you think it could not get any further, he was hung on a cross. He was enclosed in death, and that he was buried in a tomb. And the darkness of that time, the darkness of that experience, the finality of that moment, that is the height of man's impossibility. It is then that we saw the power of God's salvation made clear and evident. And God called his son from death back to life through the angel Gabriel, who rolled away that stone from the tomb. God ushered these words, Jesus, come forth. And I'm telling you, God wants you to experience everything that he's allowed Jesus to experience while here. And if he can bring Jesus back from the death, there's nothing that you're facing right now, no matter how dark, that he will not be able to bring you back from. That same restoration power, that same redemptive power, that same reviving power, that same renewing power, that same resurrection power demonstrated by God in raising his son back to life is the same power of salvation that he calls you to experience with him today. Can you hear him? Your Father in glory sees where you are, knows where you are, and says, come forth. My question is, my friends, what do you need resurrection from? Where do you need resurrection from? Whatever you're dealing with, however long you've been there, whatever you've done and who with, whenever you said that thing to God that seemed to stop your connection with him, that thing that happened in your family, that thing that happened on the job, the thing that happened in your life, in your marriage, your discouragement, your discomfort, your sadness. It is not so dark there that God can't reach you. He says to you this morning, come forth. I can fix the sadness. I can fix the discomfort. Just Come forth. It's not so dark that I can't see you. The dark and the light are the same to me. Come forth. This morning, I want to remind you that while you call upon him in prayer, he's calling upon you with his power to come forth. And it is in this context of your prayer and his power that I'd like to focus your attention on a familiar story found in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John. I would invite you to join me there. John chapter 11. And we'll begin at verse 1. John chapter 11. Now I will spoil the story. You know that this is not just about Lazarus's death, but since we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, since we're talking about coming forth, you know what happens in the end. That faced with the darkness of death, that Lazarus is brought back forth from the dead to life. But there are a couple of things I want you to notice that I'd like you to focus on as we take a look at this story of coming forth. First, the subject of this miracle, Lazarus, and the subject of the experience, his family, Martha and Mary, are extremely close friends with Jesus. They have a relationship with him. He would often go to their house and spend time at Bethany. It was escape away from the throngs of people. He could be himself. He could let his hair down. He could relax and just talk to them. He loved them, the Bible tells us. Look at what it says. Verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus, of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So here you have this triangle of two sisters and a brother, and one brother is sick. And because of the relationship and because of the acknowledgement that Jesus has power to change colors from one to another, to change death back to life, to change disease back to health, to change blight to sight, because Jesus has the ability and demonstrated this to do this in front of them, that they know that based on the relationship that they have in their year 2020, that when the challenge comes with COVID, when the challenge comes with health, when the challenge comes with finances, when the challenge comes with loneliness, with despondency, with despair, with disillusion, when the challenge comes, that if they send a message to their Jesus who loves them now, that he will respond. Not only because of who he is, but because of who they are. And my friends, you have a relationship with Jesus. You ought to expect, because he's done it before. He's the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow. You have every expectation that when you pray and you ask, that he will do abundantly more than you think to ask, to do, or think. And he will do those things for you. They have every right to expect that. I know he's sick unto death, but we just need to get word to Jesus because of a relationship with him. Verse 3, therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, the sickness is not unto death. I want you to not miss what's taking place. In the 10th chapter, which we've not read, we won't read today, but in the 10th chapter, Jesus, they attempted to stone him to death because he said that he was God. And he escaped by the very skin of his teeth from them. And he ran from there and he escaped and he went, the Bible says, to the place where John the Baptist first baptized. And when you go back to that, you find that that place was 20 miles away. So Jesus is 20 miles in chapter 11 away from Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. They send 20 miles a messenger, and Jesus receives the message. One has to expect that the messenger hears Jesus's response. Remember, look at verse 3. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. Verse 4. When Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death. When the messengers go back to Mary and Martha, ought they not to be consoled? Jesus said it's going to be all right. That's the mindset they have. And what happens? Lazarus dies. Jesus said it was going to work out, and it didn't. In your 2020, have you prayed? Have you begged? And the Spirit told you, don't you worry about it. It's going to work out. And in your human eyes, you see that it appears not to work out. There's something that Jesus is attempting to do. We know he raises Lazarus, but he needs to raise something inside of these people now. And I would suggest to you that if you're praying in this year, this memorable year, this remarkable year, this daunting year, and it has not worked out, that it does not mean that God cannot bring you forth from that thing that is bothering you, concerning you, keeping you at bay. So the relationship is there. The relationship drives certain expectations of Jesus. Jesus hears the news. He says, this is not something that will lead to death. Let's continue. Look at verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. However, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 days. 20 miles away, he does not make a move for 2 days. It reinforces in the minds of the disciples that Lazarus is going to be all right. The Savior is not in a rush to go. And he has said this is not leading to death. There are going to be some times where even your prayer warriors are hearing, you're praying, you're begging God, you're pleading to God. And it appears that he's going to answer in the affirmative in the way that you want. And even those around you will think that it's going to be all right, even though they don't see the danger that's coming. But all of this is not a failure on the part of God. God, I remind you, calls Lazarus back to life. That there's nothing that's happening, even though that you may be discouraged by it, that he will not be able to bring you back from. They were praying that he would not die. Jesus was planning for a resurrection. You might be praying that you don't lose the house. Jesus might be planning for a new home. You might be praying that you don't lose the job. Jesus might be planning for a better environment. I'm telling you that sometimes Jesus is misunderstood in what he says. In this entire chapter, everything that Jesus says was misunderstood. He says here, the sickness is not unto death. He knew that ultimately, when he was done, Lazarus would live. but they misunderstood. Later in the chapter, here we find in verse 11, he says, our friend Lazarus sleepeth. To disciples, they misunderstood, for he spoke of Lazarus's death. Every time that Jesus speaks here to the people who are around him, to the people who have relationship with him, he's speaking about a different plane or different dynamic than they are able to relate to. And it's very possible, my friends, that you might be praying even right now for a circumstance that is acute, that's hurting you, that's damaging right now, that's keeping you in darkness. But what he is calling on you for is power for a completely different experience. And you have to ask God to reveal this to you. It will be revealed to this family in just a moment. So they pray. He says he won't die. He says to the disciples, he's sleeping, but he really means the death. And ultimately he says to the disciples, Lazarus is dead in verse 14. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. The disciples are so caught up in the fact that he was almost stoned back in Jerusalem that they don't want him to go. And look at verse 16. Then said Thomas, who is called Didymus, one of his fellow disciples, let us go also, that we may die with him. Jesus is saying, Lazarus is dead. Let us go to him. Man, if Jesus is telling me, let's go where someone is dead, having read the Bible now, I'm expecting he's going to do a miracle. But when he says that in front of them, they are so caught up in what's happening in the world around them, they think he's going to get stoned to death. And the only reason Thomas wants to follow him is that he might die with his master. But his master's not going there about death. He's going there about life. Are we so caught up in the things of 2020 that we are not cognizant of the things of our Lord Jesus Christ? Are we so caught up in the rising of death numbers that we're not caught up with how many people he saved before they died of COVID this year? Are we so caught up in the world around us that we have allowed the noise of the world to drown out the fact that God's Son will come again and receive unto himself those who have died even this year? Our minds have to be focused on the thing of God. His thinking going into this is the one thing he'll say to Lazarus, come forth. And my friends, we have to have our minds focused on that as well. Mary and Martha meet him at these different times. First, Martha leaves Mary. Mary is in the house reflecting on what has transpired, wondering, why is it that Jesus said everything was going to be all right, but Lazarus is dead? She's reflecting on that. She cannot make sense of it. Martha can't make sense of it either. And when she hears that Jesus has taken the 20-mile trek to where they are, to be in Bethany, she goes out on the road to meet him. She can't meet him at the house because the Jews are all in the house. And when she meets him, she asks him this question. She says, in verse 21, Lord, if thou had been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, if you had just worked out this thing, my relative wouldn't have gotten COVID. Lord, if you had just answered, I wouldn't be in this spot. Lord, if you had protected me, they would never have done that to me. Lord, I wouldn't be in this place if you just responded. You said everything was going to be all right. I prayed to you. The message got to you. I know that because the messengers came back. Lord, I didn't ask Elder Dever to call me and say, I've been praying for you and I know it's going to be all right. You sent him. Lord, I didn't ask Elder Mayo to come and tell me the same. You sent her and you gave me the feeling that everything was going to be all right. And now, Lord, if you had just done what you had said, but my brother is dead. My relative has COVID. But now I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to live. I'm in my place of disappointment because you didn't show up. Jesus says to her, though it would go unrecognized, in verse 23, thy brother shall rise again. She says, yes, 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 I know that he will rise at the resurrection. He says, listen, if you really believe he'll rise at the resurrection, you need to understand who I am. I am the resurrection and the life. If I am there, he'll be well. I told you this is not about death. Don't you worry about it. This is about a resurrection. I am, Matthew read it for us earlier, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he be dead, yet shall he live. And I love Lazarus, and I love Chestnut Hill, and I love the membership here, and I love my people. Yes, you're dealing with the despondency. Yes, you're dealing with dark times. But when I show up, what was dead becomes alive. And if you would just hearken to my voice and come to me when I say come forth, then every little thing will work itself out. Mary comes, she has the same question, why have you not come? There is something worth noting as we take a look at verse 33. The mourners are there who have followed Mary from the house. These are professional mourners. They wail loudly. They do this for days, and they're paid to do this. When Jesus hears all of this and sees the hypocrisy of it, in verse 33 says that when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. This groaning, this word that's used there, actually means to pant or to snort. He snorted with indignation. It was a disturbance of the mind. It was an emotional response from Jesus that I see her weeping, but what are these folk doing? I can't believe that I'm showing up to bring resurrection and these folk don't get it yet. And there was a righteous indignation on Jesus's part here. He says, where have you laid him? Let's get past this. And when they tell him, they go to the place, Jesus says, take away the stone. I want you to pay close attention here now. While you're calling on him with prayer, he's calling on you with his power. Jesus has to do a couple of things first to pull you out of the darkness where you are and into his marvelous light. The stone that blocks you from experiencing the resurrection power of Jesus, he will remove that. He removes that. And while people think that it would not be wise to raise this person up or uncover the grave, he ignores that. And look at what he says in verse 43. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The original language says, hither, out. Come hither, out of where you are. Where are you this morning? In your dark place. I'm telling you that God has the power and the desire to tell you, to draw you, to pull you out of that place, out of that thing, away from that thing. Where are you? He says, come hither, out. Come out of that place. I can fix it for you. I can change it for you. Don't stay there. If you stay there, you will die. Come hither, out to me. The call is one thing. Sometimes we respond to God, but the trappings of the world and the things that bind us to the world, the things that would identify us as dead, as not having life, even when God calls on us and we respond, they're still draped around us. And you look here, you need to understand, look at verse 44. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound with a napkin. Even when God calls you, and even when you respond, and you come out of your darkness, he still has to remove the things that reminded you of where you were. He still has to remove the bandages and the bindings. He still has to remove the face covering. He still needs you, even though you're responding to him, he needs to do more change that will cause you to see him as he is. Lazarus is called forth, but more work needed to be done on Lazarus, even when he came forth. While you pray to him, he calls to you with his power. The instructions that takes place there is part of or sanctification, removing these things from you that are unlike him. He is life. He removes those things that are like death so that you might have a different kind of life. I wonder what things you're faced with this morning. As God's power of salvation is real, that he pulls on us, that he takes off the burial clothes and he covers us with his robe of righteousness. Where are you that you need this treatment from God? Wherever you are, no matter how dark it is, no matter how long you've been there, I am telling you this morning, because the power of God's salvation is real, that if you but listen and hearken to his voice, and hither out, come out to him, he will stand you up when everyone else thought you were dead. He will lift you up when you thought you had no energy to stand. He'll wind you up, point you in the right direction, remove everything that is sinful from you, so that when others look at you, they will see him, for you will be draped in his robe of righteousness. He's calling you with the challenge that you're faced with today to come forth, hither out. If he can do it for Jesus, he can do it for you. If he can do it for Lazarus, he can do it for you. And he's not just going to do it for you, he's going to do it for your family, so that they can see that you serve a God that does more than anyone can imagine. He'll do it for the doctors who will be amazed. He'll do it for your church family. He will do it for your community, so that they can come to an understanding that Jesus is real, that the power of God's salvation cannot be compressed and put away, that it is larger than anything that you can imagine. Come to him today. Give yourself to him today. No one else needs to know where you're coming from. Just go to him.